A kid in my class had to go to Riley Hospital. About the same time we were studying that Riley poet guy, James Whitcomb Riley. I asked my mom if the hospital was built by Riley's family, and she said she didn't know. My teacher said it was very smart of me to make that connection, putting together the past and the present. She said finding out about who built Riley Hospital would be a good project for me. And guess what I found out? Kids, like you and me, built Riley Hospital. We didn't do it all by ourselves, though. We were part of a big project Hoosiers did together back in the 1920s. This Riley guy was a real popular performer. Before radio and TV, guys like Riley went from city to city speaking and reciting poetry. Riley was one of the best-loved performers in his time. And the time was really different. James Whitcomb Riley was born in 1849 in a small cabin in Greenfield, Indiana. James's father, Reuben Riley, was a respected lawyer. He was also a captain in the Civil War. James learned how to tell stories in front of lots of people from his father. Speaking in front of a crowd didn't scare him. James loved being with his mother, Elizabeth Riley. She was kind and patient, and she loved telling stories and making up rhymes. With a father who spoke to large groups and a mom who loved telling stories and making up rhymes, it's no wonder one of their kids turned out to be James Whitcomb Riley. James had 5 brothers and sisters: John, Martha, Elva May, Humboldt, and Mary. Mary was his favorite. As the Riley family was able, they added on to the original cabin until it became a pretty big house. That house is a museum today, and you can visit it in Greenfield. James didn't like school very much. He often got into trouble. Even though he didn't like school, he loved to read, and he also loved music and art. He played drums in a band in Greenfield. He could also play the guitar and the violin. When James left Greenfield, he joined what is called a medicine show. He wrote and performed poems. He also roamed Indiana painting signs to advertise businesses. He had lots of talents. When James was almost 30, he moved to Indianapolis to write articles, stories, and poems for a newspaper. His poems were published into books. By the time he was in his early 40s, he was very famous, and he came to live with some friends on a little road called Lockerbie Street. In his last years, James became so famous he was recognized everywhere. Children in Indiana began celebrating his birthday in 1911, and by 1915, Riley Day was almost a national holiday. Many from the Lockerbie Street neighborhood gathered to honor Riley on the front lawn of the place where he lived. And that's where I found myself, on the front lawn of the house on Lockerbie Street. James Whitcomb Riley never owned this house. He lived there like a renter. I could never learn all the neat stuff the ladies inside know about Mr. Riley. They're called docents, and they give tours of this home. It's like Mrs. Stubbs, one of my docent guides, said.
The house is most charming. I think the thing that thrills me with the home is the fact that it is a preservation. We have so few opportunities to see preservations in this world, and to be able to walk into a home and see things as they were back at the time that it was turned over from a private home in 1916 is really remarkable.
You just gotta see this place. It's a really pretty house, but I don't see any kid stuff around. The docents say that no children ever lived here. Maybe that's why it all looks so fancy. It was built in Victorian times, and people lived differently then.
This house was built in 1872 by John and Charlotte Nickham. Mr. Nickham owned a large baking company here in town. Their daughter Magdalena and her husband Charles Holstein lived in the house with their parents, never had any children, so this was always an adult household with the two couples living here.
The front hall is real long, and the ceiling is really neat. Everything is hand-painted by the Italian artists. Nobody knows their names, but they sure did a good job. This big thing with knobs on it, just inside the door, the docents call it a hall tree. Riley probably hung his coat and hat on it instead of in a closet.
Our hall tree is a very imposing piece of furniture. The long pegs were for the men's tall hats, and those were attached to side doors which would swing open, and the men's walking sticks placed behind those. Umbrellas would lean against side arms to drip into cast iron pans. Coats would go behind the mirrored door, and if their overshoes were fairly dry, they could place those into the drawer underneath the marble bench. A very practical piece of furniture, but it does help to have a 14-foot ceiling in the front hallway.
Look at this room with all the faces and flowers and the piano and guitar just waiting for someone to come and play them. Even the ceiling is full of flowers, and the carpet too.
Carpeting in all of the rooms is wall to wall. It's not made in one large piece like our carpets are today. However, if you look closely, you can see the seams where it was made in narrow, short strips and then stitched together until it fit the size of the room.
The chandelier in the drawing room is not the original one to the home. This is one that was a gift to the home from Mr. Riley, and it was made in France in the 1840s. So when it came here in the late 1890s, was already a fine old piece.
And look at the fireplace. There's a mirror in it instead of a fire. One of the guides said that the mirror was for the ladies. In Victorian times, girls wore real long skirts. The mirror was in the fireplace so that they could check to see if their petticoats were showing. The picture over the fireplace sure is pretty. It's a picture of Mrs. Holstein. Across the hall, there's a room with lots of books. Remembering that Mr. Riley loved to read, I guess he spent a lot of time here. There are all kinds of books. If you could put your head right under the light, the ceiling has a really neat pattern. The docents say Mr. Riley met his friends here.
One of Mr. Riley's friends was Joel Chandler Harris.
Mr. Harris and Mr. Riley were very close friends, and it was Mr. Riley who encouraged Mr. Harris to have his Uncle Remus stories published. Mr. Riley was the first American poet to successfully write in dialect, and Mr. Harris was the first to write in Southern dialect.
This house has 2 dining rooms, one they call the family dining room and one they call the formal dining room. The guides told me that Mr. Riley really likes snickerdoodles and mincemeat pie. There's a recipe for snickerdoodles in the kitchen here. I bet he never ate snickerdoodles or mincemeat pie out of those silver cups in the formal dining room.
On the sideboard, we have several of our orange cups, which were made of silver. And oranges were not common in the North in those days because they didn't have the transportation that we have today to bring the oranges up from Florida, and certainly not from California.
Can you imagine oranges being so special that they had their own dish? Now that's formal. Upstairs, the front hall has 4 neat bedrooms. The guest room where you and I would have stayed had we visited Mr. Riley. The Holstein's bedroom, complete with sitting room. The Nickums' bedroom, they were Mrs. Holstein's parents. of course, Mr. Riley's room. Wow, what a neat feeling to stand in the doorway. Look at all the Riley things.
Above the fireplace is a painting of Mr. Riley's pet poodle, Lockerbie, who was named after the street out in front of the house. The painting itself was done by Wayman Adams, a very famous Indiana artist.
It looks like someone almost wore out that wicker chair. The docents say Mr. Riley had a stroke, and the chair was probably ordered to help him relax. Look at his desk. Do you think he put anything in the drawer there in the floor to your right? And what are those shoes? Look, here's a letter. October 27th, 1915. Dear friends of Mr. Riley, Mr. Riley was charmed with your verse. I am fulfilling your request by sending a pair of shoes in which he has tread the poetic heights as well as sauntered along Lockerbie Street. Very sincerely yours, Edmund H. Idle. I'll have to ask more about those next time I visit. In the hall, there's a desk Mr. Riley had in his office downtown. His razors are in the cabinet across from the desk. Down the hall the other way, there's a bathroom, maybe one of the first in Indianapolis. At the end of the hall is Katie Kendall's room. Katie was the housekeeper for Mrs. Holstein and became the first hostess when this home was opened as a museum. Look at Katie's floor. See the grate? This room didn't have any heat because it was heated from the stove directly beneath it in the kitchen. The heat just came right up through the floor. Neat, huh? So you might be asking now, what does all this stuff have to do with who built Riley Hospital? Mr. Riley didn't own the home he lived in, and he never married. Who built the hospital? And what's this house have to do with it anyway? I found out that the people who bought this house after Mr. Riley and the Holsteins passed away are the same people who asked kids like you and me to help build a children's hospital in Mr. Riley's name. They were his personal friends. They loved him and they missed him a lot, and so they formed the James Whitcomb Riley Memorial Association. They knew they were lucky to have been Riley's personal friends. They knew lots of people he'd never met loved him too. They tried to decide what would be the perfect memorial to everyone's good friend, James Whitcomb Riley. One guy in the group was a doctor, and when he suggested a hospital just for children, everybody got really excited. A hospital costs a lot of money to build, and so the Riley Memorial Association set out to ask all of us to help. And we did it. All of us in Indiana gave enough money in Riley's memory to build the James Whitcomb Riley Hospital for Children. James Whitcomb Riley Memorial Association still exists today. It's an association of people who still own and operate the home in Lockerbie as a museum. They still raise and manage money for Riley Hospital, and they also run a camp for kids with physical disabilities called, can you guess? Camp Riley. And kids like you and me still get to help Riley too. Just like kids who started celebrating his birthday back in 1911, we can still learn about Mr. Riley's life, read his poems, and hold pageants. We can still visit his boyhood home in Greenfield, Indiana, the Victorian home on Lockerbie Street, and his tomb in Crown Hill Cemetery. We can study life in Victorian times. We can memorize his poems and recite them like he used to do. But maybe best of all, we can still do projects for the hospital kids like us build in his name. I like knowing that. I like connecting the past and the present. Gosh, by helping Riley Hospital, we connect the past, the present, and the future. Cool. I really like that.